Hello, class. Welcome to Psychology 200. As you know, we are still under coronavirus pandemic, and so we are lecturing and working from remote sites and not on Lawson State Community Campus. But we are studying Chapter 13, Psychological Disorders, this week. So, excuse me, many of you are familiar with psychological disorders. You may even know someone who has a diagnosis. Many of you, just like myself from time to time, have practiced armchair psychology. But in this chapter, we will look at how psychologists define psychological disorders, how they are classified, and how an individual is able to receive a diagnosis for a particular psychological disorder. First, we look at the abnormality of behavior. There are certain criteria that are used to distinguish a behavior that makes it normal versus abnormal. So what is abnormal behavior? And we will not go through each slide with the conversation, but you have your PowerPoints, you also have your textbooks, you have your e-textbooks, and as well as this lecture. So I will go through it relatively quickly, but again, you do have other reference materials, so please use those as well. So what is abnormal behavior? In order to understand what is abnormal, we must look at what's normal first. Psychological disorders are characterized by distinctive patterns of abnormal behavior that impair our ability to function in our daily lives. I want you to key in on that because as we go through the chapter, we're going to find that many people have symptoms of a psychological disorder but may not have the diagnosis. But one of the things or traits or characteristics is going to define that psychological disorder is how it affects our ability to function in our everyday lives. Can you take care of your family? Can you still get up and go to work? Can you get up and get dressed? Does it interfere with any of those routine activities that we do on a day-to-day basis? So keep that in mind as you go through this chapter before you begin diagnosing yourself or your family members. Psychologists typically identify abnormal behavior based on a combination of the following criteria: this unusualness, social distance, and you can read more about these 6 items in your text or in your ebook. One of the things we know is that any of these alone will not get you a psychological disorder. Emotional distress, at some point, all of us or any of us may be distressed emotionally. We may engage in foolish or dangerous behavior. How many of you have ever thought that you heard someone call your name? That's a faulty perception or interpretation of reality. Some people may even call it a hallucination. But take care, because by themselves, they will not provide a psychological diagnosis. In fact, you have to have at least 4 of the 6 at the same time in order to begin to look at a psychological disorder. Remember also that certain behaviors, while they may have seemed abnormal in one culture, may be just perfectly fine, pretty normal in other cultures. So we have to be mindful of that. You have to keep those things in mind. And there are a different number of paradigms used to understand abnormal behavior. For years, and I've told you on times before, that psychology as a science is relatively young, probably 150 years or a little better than that. When we first started to classify psychological disorders, we looked at a medical model. And so they had disorders, they had mental illness, they were treated in mental hospitals. And then as time progressed, we started to move more toward a psychological model, bringing to bear different theoretical perspectives on understanding and interpreting psychological or abnormal behavior. The Athensy stress model is one of those that we're likely to use to evaluate. The diathesis is a predisposition or vulnerability to develop this disorder. Perhaps your parents may have had anxiety or schizophrenia or some other family member with a strong genetic tie. So you are predisposed to that condition. Then you add, in addition to that, put a little environmental stressors on there: prenatal trauma, childhood abuse, family conflict, significant life changes. That could be either taking another job, moving out of the city away from family members, going into the military, starting college, making a choice between get married, any significant life change. And that could possibly, not saying that it will, but it could possibly lend itself to a psychological disorder. The stronger the diathesis, the less stress is necessary to produce the disorder. I'm sure that many of you can agree with that, but again, not all of us will have a clinical diagnosis. Some of us will have features, some will have symptoms, but not all will be clinical. Now, how common are psychological disorders? They affect many people in the United States. Nearly 40% of Americans develop some diagnosable disorder at some point in their lives. The way we determine or classify behaviors, we have what's known in the world of psychology, psychiatry, is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder, the DSM-5. It is sometimes even considered the Bible of psychopathology in our field, and it is used to assist clinicians with the diagnosis of behavior. If you look over here, you can see the prevalence of psychological disorders. Our mood disorders, and we're going to talk more about these as we go through the chapter. Anxiety, substance disorders, and you may or may not be aware that substance abuse, substance use are classified as psychological disorders, but here they are. And then just the groupings of several others. And we're looking at these disorders over the past year or even over a lifetime of an individual. So again, you can read more details about those later. This again, as we see in class, is just an overview of what we've talked about in here. Psychological disorders. Anxiety-related disorder. This is an emotional state of uneasiness or distress associated with worry or apprehension. No doubt all of us have been a little worried, concerned about things from time to time, but just worry alone will not yield us, I'm sorry y'all, a diagnosis of anxiety. You may or may not believe or have thought that these disorders are listed under an anxiety disorder. Things like phobias and irrational excessive fear, panic disorder, generalized anxiety, obsessive compulsive. This is one you hear so much about lately in our news and in movies. Just a lot of people having the diagnosis of OCD. Please read more details about what these are. Here's your cognitive model of panic. These are explanations or theories regarding how these particular disorders are developed in individuals. Here's your overview again with a little bit more information about the prevalence, symptoms, and the features that go along with each of those psychological disorders under anxiety-related disorders. So pay close attention to that. Now we're looking at dissociative and somatic symptoms and related disorders. This is a class of psychological disorders involving changes in consciousness, memory, and self-identity. What I really want to point out is while you hear these a lot in movies, you don't see these a lot in clinical practice. You aren't able to see many of these diagnoses. For whatever reason, they're not as common as some of the others, say anxiety or mood disorders. Dissociative identity, at one time we called it multiple personality. You may have heard of that. Dissociative amnesia is an unexplained memory loss that has no physical basis. You may or may not have heard of that one. Let's see, conversion disorders. This is involving a significant loss of change in physical functioning that cannot be explained by a medical cause. What happens is, for instance, you're looking at these airplanes, and so during wartime, some of the pilots would develop blindness, And you know that blind people typically cannot fly planes, fighter jets, or otherwise. And so, even though they reported blindness, there were no physical basis for the blindness. Nothing was wrong with their eyes, their retina, um, their optic nerve. They just could not see. And so, that was what conversion disorder is based on. Then you have the somatic disorder, formerly called hypochondriasis. And again, here is an overview of the dissociative disorders. So please, again, look at that. It follows the same as our anxiety disorder. Mood disorders are probably some of the most common ones that we're going to see in psychology. Daily life involves ups and downs, but when changes in mood become excessive or interfere with one's ability to function again, they may indicate the presence of a mood disorder. Major depressive disorder. Depression is known as the common cold of psychopathology. Bipolar disorder, this is something that you're hearing more and more about, the alternating highs and lows of a psychological disorder. Here again are cognitive distortions that you think about or that can explain how or why an individual may develop those symptoms of mood disorder. Suicide is something that you see a lot with people who have mood disorders. Here's some common myths about suicide, and here is the chart that explains the disorder, the prevalent symptoms, and associated features with mood disorders. We want to look at schizophrenia. I always say that this is one of the hardest psychological disorders you can come away with. If you had a choice, and I don't mean this lightly, but you don't want this one. It's very intrusive. Though some people incorrectly believe that schizophrenia refers to split personality, it actually refers to a loss of contact with reality. Irrational behavior in this disorder affects 1% of the world's population. So some of the symptoms associated with schizophrenia, thought disorders, false perceptions or hallucinations, delusions, which are false beliefs, like they believe they're someone who they're not, but typically is a person who's been known throughout history. Some of the causes of schizophrenia is one of the leading causes is imbalances in the neurotransmitter dopamine. We use PET scans so that we can view the brain of an individual who has schizophrenia, and we show that there's lesser frontal activity in the brains of people with the diagnosis of schizophrenia. Again, here's an overview chart. And personality disorders. Many times when we hear personality disorder, the first one we think about is antisocial personality, but it's typically not what we tend to think of when we hear that. So look at that and tell me if it lines up with what you typically think is antisocial personality disorder. Then you have your borderline personality disorder. And here they are, again, the overview for those. And I tried to get through as quickly as possible to give you an overview of the lecture. I hope that you have learned something. If you have questions, refer to your text, refer to other literature, and you should be fine. Thank you. Have a great evening.